Hey guys, what is up? Um, by the time this comes out, I will be in Mongolia. Hoping to post this Tuesday, the 28th. So, hello from the past. I hope everything in the future is going well. Because it's not going well for me. I saw a meme on Twitter that referred to a bunch of video games I like as Unk Slop. Um, At first, I thought it was like supposed to mean like uncle or something, so like someone who's not quite middle aged yet. But then I realized that just means Unkslop just means quality. So anyway, so moving on from reviewing very quickly what we did last week are the three basic theories: mercantilism, liberalism, and Marxism, or you can say mercantilism if depending on who you're talking to. And they're pretty basic, right? Mercantilism, tariffs to protect domestic industry. Liberalism gets rid of the tariffs and promotes free trade everywhere. And then Marxism is even more government control in the economy as opposed to liberalism. Uh, but it's in the effort of making a classless, exploitationless society. So for this week, we're going to be going over cooperation and competition. So what do we mean by competition? Well, these factors of production, or what states are able to use to create more stuff, um, and how they are taken, competitively at least. And there's cooperation, which is mainly an effect of globalism. So we've got the first, second waves of globalism, and then the current after hegemony that we live in now. And then we're going to finish it with the silver rule, or what the government does to regulate all of this and how. So in normal economics, like the mainstream economics, we say that there are three factors of production. So stuff you need to make stuff. You want to take a second and think about what they are. I'll give you a three, two, maybe pause the video, restart it. One, that they are land. You need land to make some stuff. Labor and capital. And then among a subset of political scientists and economists, there is actually a fourth factor of production. The more mainstream count it under capital, actually, because it's a type of intellectual property. I don't really have a dog in the fight, but one of the professors, like full professors in the department, very much does. So we're gonna throw some credit to him and say that this is a factor of production too, and that's technology. But we're going to give it kinda and a smiley face. So speaking of UNCSLOP, or competition for land, this is, I think, what most people think of when um, they think of competition for land as actual conquest. So taking over territories. So this is a map of famous battles Napoleon fought. So labor is the actual human inputs that create stuff. Um, and when we talk about land, labor, and capital, we're normally talking about a combination of the three, um, plus or minus technology. So you already have to have some sort of, you normally need at least labor and capital to make something. Deep sea fishing, great example of not needing land, kinda. Oil rigging, another type of labor. And then coffee bean pickers. I thought this was interesting because, like, who smiles like that at any job? But every time I see photos of coffee bean pickers, they're always smiling, which makes me think that something more nefarious is afoot. that we all know, horrible hours and wages, but still. Moving on to a different type of hell other than blue collar work is what I used to do actually before academia. I was a State Farm salesman. I hated every minute of it. Tech company, but corporate labor too counts under this. Um, yeah, the Gen Z boss in a mini video was hilarious, by the way. I don't know if that's still relevant with how fast memes move, but how pissed off people got about that I thought was so funny. Another form of labor is actually the most difficult job that people don't realize that there is, which is online teaching political science from your house. It's a joke. And so, how you define capital counts or informs whether or not you count technology as its own fourth factor of production or not. But for this definition from Investopedia, anything that confers value or benefit to its owner, such as factory, its machinery, intellectual property like patents, so that would be technology, or the financial assets of a business or an individual. So anything that adds value that isn't land, because land doesn't inherently add value. Sometimes it loses value, for example, and labor. I mean, I can, um, I think that Marx would have a different definition of labor within this because he believed in the labor theory of value, or the cost of something. The only input that should determine the cost of something is really how much work you put into it. So if it takes 5 hours of labor to make a bowl, okay, you subtract the cost of resources and then your hourly wages times 5, and then that's what the bowl should be worth. The problem with that is that not all laborers are actually equal, or at least equal in their ability to do work. For example, I was a horrible salesman at State Farm. I don't care about insurance enough to actually try to make it interesting for other people. I doubt most people do. So the amount of hours I would put into getting sales, I would still generate less revenue for the company than the lady in the office or in the desk next to mine, Michelle. Homegirl was an assassin. It was really fun to watch. Well, that's not exactly creating a product, you might say. So another example would be art. My cousin went to art school, SCAD, I think it's called, South Carolina or Savannah College of Art and Design. Anything she draws, puts 2 or 3 hours into a drawing, is going to look way better than anything I do. So there's this difference between labor and skilled labor that the labor theory of value doesn't really account for. Going back to capital, though, you can think of it as anything that is not land that you can take a loan out on. So you can take a loan out on a business or a house or anything like that. Or if it's not that, then it's also money. So it's either anything non-land you can take a loan out on or just cold hard cash. Capital flows and inflows were especially big during this big foreign direct investment boom we have after World War II, especially as China began to open up. Um, Chinese land is cheaper than American land. Chinese labor is cheaper than American labor. So if you exchange capital for land and labor, you can make very, very cheap products. And so that was sort of the deal generations before most of us made, which was, okay, we're going to be in this permanent giving investment to China mindset, permanent sending capital their way, but we get to have all the cheap plastic stuff we want. We'll expand on that in a bit. And so there are non-peaceful ways to get all of these, land, labor, and capital, right? Of course, the we talked about this already, but the non-peaceful way to gain land is mainly through conquest. And so we have characters like early on Alexander the Great from Macedonia, um, often seen as this hero for what would later be a lot of the Roman emperors, especially Julius Caesar. Now we look at Alexander the Great and think, well, all he did was kill people and take their land, and that's all any of these conquerors did. So maybe drop the Great later on, or keep it. I mean, not trying to cancel a guy for something he did 2,500 years ago. Anyway, you have like Genghis Khan, an interesting case. Obviously, speaking of someone who's in Mongolia right now, France will try to shy away from their history with Napoleon, who was also a conqueror. And we're about to talk to Germany, or we're about to talk about Germany, about how they shied away from, you know who. Well, I treat him like he's Voldemort, Hitler. Um, whereas the Mongols or Mongolians tend to actually not only apologize for what Genghis Khan did, but actually still double down and talk about what a cool guy he was. I don't personally agree, um, but I'm not Mongolian, so yeah. Trajan from ancient Rome, like I said, so many of the Roman emperors were fanboys of Alexander. You have Charlemagne, who united a lot of what would later become France. William the Conqueror, of course, taking Norman rule to the UK. And then I don't like looking at pictures of Hitler or swastikas really, but I thought this was worth bringing up was this book called The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Schreier, I think is how you pronounce his name. But he was a journalist who lived, an American journalist who lived in Berlin basically until the war broke out. So he got to see firsthand a lot of the rise of the Nazi Party and all the different, we'd say, seeds that would metastasize later on into what became the Third Reich. And so, of course, he has to write about the fall too. So 1945 is when the fall is, and then he takes a couple more years, I think until the 60s or late 50s, to finally publish this book as to give a real debrief of what the world was like after all this happened. And what's interesting is in the foreword of the book, he talks about how he thinks Hitler is going to be the last big conqueror. I don't think you need me to tell you, killing people and taking their land is already, as I believe the kids would call, cringe. But to drop the jokes for a second, Hitler did take it to such an extreme level that conquest is often seen nowadays as something you just don't do. That's far more rare now. But highly recommend that book. It's a fantastic read. Um, Highly recommend the ebook though, so you don't have to carry around a big book with a swastika on it. Before I get onto this slide, I do feel like I need to reiterate, Rise and Fall of the Third Reich is not a hagiography or anything of the Third Reich. It, like I said, Schreier, who wrote it, was an American, and so he spoke German. He lived in Germany. You think he'd have some sympathies toward the Nazis. If your opinion of Hitler could go lower, I mean, he's literally Hitler, but if it could go lower, this would be the book to do it. Anyway, acquiring labor by force is unfortunately another black spot on humanity, other than the Third Reich, of course. Some would say slavery is humanity's greatest sin. Others say it's war. Third Reich is a bit of both because they use forced labor too. But yeah, so going back as far as ancient Egypt, you have, of course, the slavery of all sorts of different people, most notably the Hebrews or Jews. Way more recent, we have chattel slavery in the United States. So I think we've established, I think, very well that the U.S. isn't this shining city on the hill. I think everyone knows that past like the fifth grade. But this is especially a low moment in U.S. history that went on for way too long. And unfortunately, it still continues to a level. Not as much as in the United States, but there is still forced servitude in a lot of the Persian Gulf states, Dubai, which we'll expand on. And then there's different types of slavery. So this is all mostly like construction or agricultural labor. But then there's also, because the internet and all these different new mechanisms for exploitation, there is sex trafficking. So when we look at human trafficking as a whole, there's an argument to be made, of course, that they're undocumented, so it's impossible to know how many human trafficking victims there are in the United States. But there's a pretty widespread belief that there are more slaves, if you count human trafficking victims, there are more slaves in the United States now than there were during the height of the antebellum South. Part of that's a function of the U.S. having a much greater population overall, but it's still interesting to think about. This is a class on U.S. foreign policy, so I might be super critical of the U.S. I also try to be complimentary of it. I think we live in a fantastic country that just has issues. So let's talk about a country that has more issues. And I've got a special, I try not to show my bias, but I've got a special dislike for Dubai. So if the slavery wasn't bad enough, it does have this reputation for being like this luxurious playground for the rich and Instagram models and the like. I believe this is one of the Fast and Furious movies that was shot there. I haven't seen a single one of these movies, so I couldn't tell you. But their crowning achievement, though, is this building on the left, the Burj Khalifa, which, if you look at the bottom right, we can see, how do I approach this tactfully? The Burj Khalifa doesn't have a plumbing system that really works. So every day they have to have these sewage trucks. So this big convoy of sewage trucks leave the Burj Khalifa with just tons and tons of you know what. So yeah, the sooner Dubai reforms and especially gets rid of the slaves, the better. And then we have Instagram models who find out about the sewage trucks, I guess. I just wanted to share this meme. Yeah, I thought it was funny. Okay, so that's land through conquest, or coercive land grabs or conquest, coercive labor grabs or slavery slash human trafficking. What about capital? Well, let's start off with two cities we're all very familiar with and one that's sort of irrelevant. But most cities, as you probably know, have nicknames. Knoxville is the Marble City. No idea why. Maybe someone who's more local than me can tell. Maybe there's a marble quarry. My hometown, Charleston, South Carolina, is known as the Holy City because it has so many churches. And then, yeah, there's this, for those of you who don't know, there's this city up north called New York City, not to be confused with New York State. It's intentionally confusing. New York City is kind of this irrelevant, I mean, it's literally full of Yankees, so who cares about New York City? But it also has a nickname, the Big Apple. So if you're ever on trivia or whatever, and someone asks a really obscure question about New York City, you'll know that its nickname is the Big Apple. Well, Paul, you super not boring sounding guy. What does this have to do with capital? Well, Rome, its nickname is the Eternal City, which might even be worse than the Big Apple. Because despite being called the Eternal City, it was sacked 6 times. Probably the most famous was the invasion of Alaric the Great in 410 AD by the Visigoths. Alaric is a pretty kooky character in himself. He actually used to work for the Romans. That's how he learned their tactics. And you see this happening with a lot of Rome's enemies. Um, but it's not conquering Rome, it's sacking Rome, which is a difference. Conquering means you have to hold it. Sacking means you take it. Um, so conquering means you have to hold it against future invasions. Sacking it means you take it, loot it for all it's worth, tear down a few statues while you're at it, and then get the hell out before reinforcements arrive. And so what they're doing is they're stealing a lot of gold, jewels, trade goods. So capital, the ability to do work later. Yeah, Alaric was kind of a weird dude, but we don't have time to go into him. Another big violent acquisition of capital was the Spanish conquest of Latin America. Um, so you have someone like Hernan Cortez on the left, burst in, give everybody smallpox, use gunpowder to kill everyone who doesn't have smallpox, and then kicks off this big trade of Spanish galleons. And so, like whenever you hear about like lost treasure in the Caribbean, especially like in Pirates of the Caribbean movies and stuff, it's almost always a Spanish galleon full of gold from Latin America. So that's acquiring capital. So they're not taking over the land primarily. They're not taking over the people primarily. They're taking the ability to do more stuff, ability to produce more stuff by way of this gold. And with all these people, I'm not trying to glorify any of them, by the way. Hernan Cortez, absolute asshole. And the Spanish policy toward Latin America is still on the fingerprints of Latin America today, even. Um, it was conquered, the people brutalized, just like in North America. But the main difference is that the Spanish were there to extract capital, while the French and the British, so mainly Protestant groups, were in North America to acquire land and actually develop the land and build infrastructure. Of course, several other horrible things have happened to Latin America. I don't want to downplay that. But these sort of baseline, what's the term in business? Level one or bottom floor investments in infrastructure eventually did lead it to where Latin America didn't have it, and because of that, made it more vulnerable to all sorts of different other forms of exploitation. Okay, so I looked it up between slides. It turns out Rise and Fall of the Third Reich was 1960. So I was right, it was late 50s, early 60s. But like I said, there was this prediction in the foreword that Nazi Germany would be the last big conquesting force in human history, which was later on supported just in 2021 by Coe and Markowitz, that it doesn't make financial sense in the current environment to actually conquer. It makes sense to do other stuff, especially looting and extracting capital, but gaining land, especially for superpowers, that doesn't even make financial sense, let morality aside. So when we look at U.S. foreign policy processes in terms of like conquering more land, well, I was looking up examples, and there's just U.S. invasion of, and I mean this is quite telling that there's all these different autofill options. I didn't even know the U.S. invaded Puerto Rico. Maybe part of the Spanish-American War. Canada was a weird one too. I dunk on Canada a lot, but love our Canadian brothers up north, even if they don't know how to, manage a housing industry. I say that with love. But that being said, is when we look at all these different places America has invaded, we either have left or it was before 1945. So to Schreier, Coe, and Markowitz's point, we see that playing out, that conquest just isn't it in this current market, which is a good thing. We don't get a lot of good news in class, but there you go. Okay, quick introduction here, but I just got word that John Markowitz actually died. So here's my sincere reaction to that. Yeah, so bless up John Markowitz. We talked about America's history with forced labor, or by its more correct term, slavery, was a big factor in making America the powerhouse it was. Even if a state wasn't directly using slaves, it was still benefiting from cheaper textiles, cheaper food, and stuff like that. That was a product of slave labor. And a lot of people say, well, there's still slavery today. Most civilizations have practiced slavery at some point. This was long after slavery was very much not in vogue, even in the international community anymore, especially the West. So slavery is bad, but it's even worse than you think. Furthermore, there's this modern slavery we talked about with human trafficking. Tennessee is thankfully not the biggest offender, but it's not the biggest offender either. So human trafficking is movement of people into different areas through force, fraud, or coercion. It's the legal definition. Um, yeah, I was surprised Nevada's #1. It makes sense when you think about it because of Vegas and all the seedy stuff that happens there. I was just dunking on Dubai. Now I'm dunking on Vegas. Um, yeah, move to Charleston. That's my advice with this, I guess. And there's also this right-wing conspiracy theory that the United States likes to destabilize the world and create refugee crises because it brings in cheaper labor and keeps it down. Keeps the price of labor down, very low. Big businesses love illegal immigrants because they reduce the cost of labor. So there's not anything nearly as bad as slavery through this migration issue, but it's still gaining human labor through force. Would you know destabilizing other countries has another benefit, the main one actually, which is looting or taking capital. So there's the big accusation, or you'd say left-wing conspiracy theory, that the war in Iraq was mainly to gain oil. Um, I think it was sort of validated in the fact that um, the U.S. nominally on the surface invaded Iraq because there was evidence of WMDs, or weapons of mass destruction, but it had oil. You take that to something like North Korea, which at the time was trying to develop and eventually did develop weapons of mass destruction in 2007. But North Korea doesn't have oil, and there was never an invasion of North Korea. So take that for what you will. And sometimes they say the quiet part out loud. 2024, my own Senator Lindsey Graham was talking about how defending Ukraine is important because of all the mineral worth we can extract from it that we've been denying Russia. And then during the Gulf War, the first invasion of Iraq, defense of Kuwait, as Saddam was leaving Kuwait, he was burning the oil derricks to prevent the U.S. from looting them. Okay, that ends our, we'll call it mini section on coercive conflict and stuff like that. So, weary traveler, if you want to take a rest here, now is a good stopping point. If you want to power through, let's go. Now, cooperation is a lot more fun to talk about because there's significantly less deaths, less war crimes. Slavery is not really a thing in this. It's all stuff trying to be above board. There's some pain, absolutely, but I would prefer cooperation to competition any day of the week. Like I said last week, your time, a few days ago, my time, but I think there's room for everybody at the top. So, for most of history, globalization or trade, globalization doesn't exist and trade is very localized. Think of like a medieval village you would see in a movie or something. You probably know the guy who made your hat, the haberdasher. You know the guy who you look right in your house, you know who made it. Um, you go from that to where we are today. I'm looking at the desk I'm sitting in. I can't even tell you where it was made, where it was actually made. So where it claims to be from, where it was actually made, and then like what we talked about with the car scheme, made in America with parts that were made in Mexico and just assembled in America. So how do we go from one to the other? Let's get into it. So trade's very localized. Even then, there's some exceptions like the Silk Road or major ports, but they're exceptions. This isn't the rule by any means. And of course, before the Silk Road and blue sea or blue ocean travel, it's non-existent. So for those who don't know, the Silk Road was this pass mainly going through what was then called Persia, what's now called Iran. They just love being in trade routes, don't they? Um, but connecting east to west mainly. And one of the big hubs for it was actually Istanbul, then known as Constantinople, and that's what gave that part of Turkey sort of its east meets west identity even today. And the Silk Road has been around longer than people realize. This is a first century Roman era coin found in Han era China. So this is before 220 AD, when the Han dynasty fell. We could talk all about the fall of the Han dynasty, but I think the department head would get mad at me for being off topic. It's not widespread. A third of the population dies of Black Death in Europe, which is terrible. And I was just talking about how there's less death in this chapter, but it vastly improves GDP per capita. And then we have the Crusades introducing the value of foreign markets. So it starts off with these horrible things, then turns into opportunity. Crusades kick off the Renaissance. For those who don't know, the Crusades were invasions from medieval Europe into the Middle East or the Levant. There are all these like Crusader kingdoms that were set up. So it was to reconquer Jerusalem and a lot of the holy sites. Depending on why they were trying to do this, different people will say different things. And that's not really what I'm looking to get into anyway. Main thing is that the Crusades introduced the people, the Europeans living there, to these foreign markets, these different spices, oils, and stuff that they could ship back to Europe and sell for a ton of money. So what ends up happening is exactly that. So eventually the Crusades fail, the Crusader states fail, the Crusader kingdoms fail. It goes back into the hands of the Saracens or Seleucids, I forget which. But what later comes from that is trade with them, so cooperation, moving from competition to cooperation. You have a middle class coming out of this through the Black Death and high GDP per capita. And so eventually what you've got is a lot of individual wealth in Europe through trade. And so here's a depiction of Europe from the 1300s and 1400s. So Black Death, I believe, broke out in 1356. I said it was 1366, but that's wrong. 1400s, you have the back foot of the Crusades. And then kicking off in the 1500s, so not that far later, you have this to this. And so Renaissance is often seen as like the high point for Europe, and it's heavily carried by trade, international cooperation. We don't talk about who they're trading with because they're still seen as these foreign and exotic lands, and we still don't know. By we, I mean the people living in Europe at the time still don't know a ton about them other than what they sell and what they give. But so this sort of high watermark for European civilization, Renaissance is effectively brought down by the different revolutions, which is another type of big development because it goes from monarchies to democracies, or at least there's more personal rights. And a quick aside is I'm focusing on Europe on this, not because of any preference for Europe. You all know I study China. But the same thing happens in China after the fall of the Han Empire in 220. Um, you have the Sui Empire or the Sui Dynasty, which doesn't last that long, and then it's later followed by the Tang Dynasty, which is characterized by two big things: one, tons of trade; two, another quote unquote golden age for ancient China. And then you sort of get echoes of both of those in the Ming Dynasty. Point being, if you're trading, you're probably, or if you're living in a golden age, you're probably trading with people. And the other thing about trading is that it's global, so that's why it's globalization, or the first big wave. So you have the Renaissance happening, all this trade, and then people are going over there to stay and then to take land. And this is where cooperation crosses into competition with stuff like colonialism and then industrialism. So we talked about all this acquisition. In Africa, you see basically all three factors of production being taken: land through colonies, labor through slavery, capital through the natural resources of Africa. Um, and being such a accessible victim for European violence is really what's held down Africa a lot for centuries now. Now, Japan isn't always an interesting case because it's one of the two big island country nations, right? Um, that have like a huge impact on world history. The other one being the UK. But they had different policies toward the rest of the world. The UK went almost everywhere and had colonies basically everywhere. The sun never sets in the British Empire, as they said. But with Japan, it was this complete reversal of that. Japan wanted to stay isolated and just have nothing to do with the rest of the world. Um, so eventually they allowed for some trade because you have to keep up at least a bit. So they start trading with the Portuguese for black powder weapons, and that becomes immensely popular. The weird irony behind that is black powder was invented in China and then made its way all the way to Europe and then from Europe to Japan, even though China and Japan are next to each other. But point being, for most of Japanese history, it's this radical isolationist. We talk about U.S. isolationism a lot in this class. Japan took it to another level. Eventually, they start trading a bit more, mainly with the Dutch, and they have this Dejima Island, is what it's called, and I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, but not very big, but it's the one place where Gaijin or outsiders are allowed in Japan to trade. And this becomes immensely important later on in Japanese history, by the way. Um, Bottom line, though, is that this island, Dejima Island, becomes the main trading part for Japan, which initially did not want to trade with the outside world. Then Admiral Perry from America rolls up, and he says, "Listen, you're not going to be isolationist anymore. You're going to trade with us, or we're going to bomb the absolute hell out of you." And so Japan is effectively dragged against its consent into trading with the United States. And so here's I don't know where this is from. I think a video game, but artist rendition of what Admiral Perry looks like to a Western artist. Here's what he actually looked like in real life, and here's how the Japanese draw him. Um, Point being, he's not remembered favorably in Japan. Eventually, this is what kicks off the Bosan War. This new part of Japan, or the imperial side of Japan, is actually opening up to the rest of the world, while the shogunate, or more traditional, are trying to hang on to their traditions. And so, like I said, kicking off the Bosan War, which is the inspiration for the movie The Last Samurai. Of course, the real Bosan War was far shorter. And you can see why, because it's black powder versus medieval weapons. And so the samurai are absolutely eradicated. And there's the scene from The Last Samurai. People always think that title's talking about Tom Cruise's character. That's not the case. Samurai is plural as well as singular, so it's talking about everyone around Tom Cruise. I thought that was worth pointing out for like the three people who've probably seen this movie. Japan forced to globalize, open up to the rest of the world, um, where you get this sort of unfortunate thing that happens where your culture becomes a commodity. People used to call it cultural appropriation. I don't know what it's called now. And yet sometimes it does get to be pretty silly. Like I don't think me eating Kroger sushi is that offensive to Japanese people. If any of y'all are Japanese, I'm happy to be corrected on that. But someone who is not Japanese prancing around in a samurai outfit he didn't earn for a tourist photo is kind of goofy. Any like radical push like that is going to have backlash. Japanese still are isolationists in their hearts. They really are today too, a lot of the time. Um, but after Japanese identity has been eroded so much by all this forced cooperation, it kicks off the Meiji Restoration and all these efforts to establish traditional Japan. And some of y'all might have spotted this already, but you have this traditional Japan, Japanese pride, Japanese supremacy, Japanese nationalism, Japanese being the master race. Well, it's not hard to imagine who they quickly became friends with during, especially the 30s and beyond. And kind of like how the autocomplete for American invasion, Japanese occupation, says a lot of what was going on around this time too. So people think that the first big push from Japan into invading other countries was Pearl Harbor, and by people think that I mean American people think that. By that point, Japan had occupied Korea for decades. It had occupied parts of China. Soon around this, China actually had to pause its civil war between the communists and nationalists so they could team up to fight Japan. And you'd think it would be like Outward Bound or something, like the communists and nationalists like take the anti-Japanese war as like a bonding exercise, and then they're like friends by the end of it. Um, like I don't know, two superheroes who hate each other and then unite to take on a bigger threat. But no, they went right back to fighting after that. But yeah, Japan gets very involved with this last wave of conquest, to reference Schreier again, and especially those of you from Oak Ridge know how this ends. Two nuclear bombs, one in Hiroshima and the other one in Nagasaki. The port town that was forced to open up trade to the West against Japanese will ended up being nuked. There's a lot of weird ironies throughout history. There's a lot of weird coincidences. But the fact that the whole how it started versus how it's going type meme, um, you really do have to feel a lot of sympathy for the Japanese for this. And I'm not debating the morality of dropping the bomb. It's more of a stars in their courses type thing. But at the same time, you can still feel bad for them. They didn't ask for this as a culture. Of course, no one has to be nuked, but still. All right. So let's go back to the 1800s. You have the British doing what they're doing, traveling everywhere, taking a bunch of shit. You have Kipling, who wrote this really racist poem called "The White Man's Burden," where the whole concept of the poem is like it's actually worked for it's invading your country and trying to make you conform to our way of life is actually hard for us too. Is basically the concept of the poem. There's quotes from it that I'm not going to repeat because I definitely don't want that shit out there. Um, but so this is already a thing with wooden sailing ships, but then the British invent something that changes everything. And this is probably one of the most efficient machines in terms of the impact it's had on, it still has on us today. I mean, we still use this. We still use different versions of this all the time. Let's hype it up. Let's build up the anticipation. Can you guess what it is? It's ya boy, the steam engine. So there is the early version invented by Watt, W-A-T-T, as in the unit of measurement is named after him. How impactful this is. But we look at nuclear sub, any type of nuclear power really is just the same thing, a steam engine with a different way to heat it up, right? But what the steam engine is able to do is make it so ships aren't reliant on wind patterns anymore. They still have to negotiate with currents, but they're not as subject to them as they were before. So blue water navy is already a thing, but this puts it into overdrive. There's all these advances in shipbuilding, copper plating. You see these Ironside ships more and more. So big kickoff into blue water navies. And then to make things even crazier, this other invention that we don't take for granted until it's gone, 2 or 3 times every winter, refrigeration. Able to bring over cold products from all over the world changes a lot of stuff too. So late 1800s, it kicks off this big boom of exports, right? All over the world, basically every civilization, except the United States, oddly enough, which is still very isolationist. And then something happens in the early 1900s that changes that. Yeah, boy, World War One. I mean, given the tone of this class, it was either going to be a Doge meme, me talking about 2008, or World War One. So you had a pretty decent shot, especially considering 2008 wasn't in the early 1900s. But yeah, World War One has a massive impact on global trade. Then, of course, the weird pause that is the Weimar years and World War Two. Now, on top of literally hundreds of people dying over this time, not a lie, hundreds of people died. This also, of course, reduced exports. So that's reflected here. Um, the thing is after these wars, everything's died down, everything's settled down. There's the Great Depression in there too, which also reduced exports. Toward the end of World War II, actually, you have Yalta. So you got Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin sort of divvying up how the world is going to be after they win. They're pretty sure they've won at this point. It's just a matter of formalities. Uh, but they've still got to figure out how to cut this cake, essentially. And part of that is not a coincidence. Of the 5 permanent members on the UN, 3 of them are the UK, Churchill, the United States, Roosevelt, and Soviet Union, later Russia through Stalin. So, like we talked about, with a heavy assist from the United States as opposed to the League of Nations, the UN is founded, which further limits conquest, competition, and increases cooperation. Now, because we're humans who are just determined to go to war with each other, going on to an earlier lesson, we talked about how, well, there's the Cold War, of course, but early on, there's this Pollyannish view that all the UN is going to form together and cooperate perfectly, where what really ends up happening is battle deaths go down, which, hey, that's great. Who wants battle deaths, right? Um, the downside is, of course, that there's actual more wars. They're just smaller and more localized. And that's when start seeing a lot of these terms like trade to GDP ratio, imports and exports in proportion to the economy. The United States imports more than it exports. China exports more than it imports. So that's just trade to GDP ratio. Um, China has a trade surplus, whereas the United States has a trade deficit. And looking at these as numbers on a balance sheet is what kicked off the trade wars, plural, I guess now. First one being in 2018, focusing on China, and then the other big round being in 2025 with the Liberation Day, quote unquote, tariffs. And of course, there's the earlier cases like the Smoot-Hawley Act we already talked about. Another big one to know is the global supply chain. So chain of operations it takes to produce and ship a good. And with these global supply chains especially, and this increased focus on trade, inventors have a bigger way to get, or have a more reliable way to get more raw materials to make more complicated machinery. And this manifested within, especially the US economy, very, very quickly. So think about all the different raw materials and resources that go into something like a TV. So like cobalt, I imagine, is one of them, but there's not a ton of cobalt in the United States. But with these global supply chains and trade, we're able to make and mass produce TVs. Or even a step before that, we're able to invent TVs. You get this doohickey, which very few students are able to guess what this is. Give you a second, build up the anticipation. That is a toaster. That is an early version of a toaster for bread. So that grate on the outside would turn red hot, and woe to whoever is enough of a silly sausage to touch it. Of course, there's ironing, all these consumer goods, right? Early vacuum cleaners, candy made with sugarcane, brought up from Latin America especially. And then cars. So cars are already a thing before the war, but now they're being mass produced with this cheap labor. So ideally, it's a system where everyone wins. Americans get all these really cool consumer products. The people who make them in their countries are able to get jobs and work their way out of poverty. And sometimes it actually works. China's a great example of that. The Chinese middle class is booming, especially since 2008. My Chinese friends will talk about their lives, and yeah, 2008, I know. But my Chinese friends will talk about their lives, and it's almost like a BC AD thing. Um, what was your life before 2008 and what was your life after 2008 is a big deal to them. And yeah, business since then is booming. And we talked about the high water mark. In some people's opinion, this is probably my own bias talking. I was barely conscious for the 90s, so who knows. Um, but a lot of people see, especially the Clinton administration and all this, not necessarily because of Clinton, just during his administration, as another high watermark for globalization, individual wealth in the United States. So, like I said, when we talk about like golden ages, it's always accompanied by a lot of trade, whether it be the Renaissance, whether it be Tang or Ming Dynasty China, or whatever we were going to call the 50s to the 90s in United States history. So, like I said, huge fan of cooperation because of stuff like this. So within the West, we get these two eras of globalism, right? The Renaissance and then the post-war years. And there's three main differences. One, movement of goods from one place to another as opposed to raw materials. So with this movement of TVs made in a factory in Taiwan or whatever, it's different than raw materials being produced and then exported to the United States, such as cobalt being directly shipped to the United States. I don't know why I'm talking about cobalt so much. I apologize. You also have this practice of foreign direct investment, or states owning factories of production in foreign countries, mainly land and capital, because it's immoral to try to own people, obviously. And so that goes to like the foreign direct investment we were talking about. The factory might be in Vietnam, but a lot of the time the US company will want to own the factory. And then globalized money, there's a standard trade currency, as opposed to taking out those scales you always see and weighing out the different amounts of gold. We talked about this other deal that the United States effectively made with Europe had more say in, but with the rest of the world, which is that the US dollar is going to be the standard currency of trade between countries. And in exchange for that, the US is going to provide a lot of security, especially for Europe. And then the relative cost of transport goes down too. It used to be like if you read something like Moby Dick, where they sail to the Pacific, it takes months and months and months. The voyage of the Mayflower to the United States, the ship the Pilgrims rode in on, took just over 2 months, what is now an 8-hour flight. So all these inputs becoming cheaper make it so trade is even more viable as time goes on. And of course, now it can be instant. Through stuff like digital products. You can buy a ebook, MP3, video game, whatever that was produced in another country, and there's not even, it can be measured in cents, it's so cheap, so less than a penny for the transaction cost. So this meme is already outdated the first time I wrote this lecture. And it's only going to be more outdated as time goes on, but 2023, the summer of 2023 was known as Barbenheimer, which I thought was such a cool idea. For one thing, the meme is very funny. It's played out and dead now, but at the time, the idea of such an upbeat movie like, of course, Oppenheimer coming out the same year as a depressing movie like Barbie. I'm joking, of course, it's the other way around. Was conceptually very funny. The memes were great while they lasted. Then it played out, and then everyone moved on to, I don't know, 6, 7, or whatever. Um, but with Barbenheimer, there's also another level to it where it's like, okay, these are the post-war years for the United States. Yeah, just in case you didn't think just in case you already thought Barbenheimer, the meme was super deep, we're about to get even deeper. Well, Paul, you super interesting guy. What do you mean? It's just Barbie and a nuclear bomb. It's like, well, could you think of a better metaphor for U.S. foreign policy? You had cheap plastic and then security threats. So it's this marriage of cooperation and competition. And so we have all this international trade going on throughout the entire world and all these different ports. If you look over around where the peninsula of Thailand reaches out towards Singapore, look at the amount of trade that goes just through there. And as we're all learning right now, the Strait of Hormuz, was it 20% of oil comes from there? And so even if we're not using Iranian or any oil from that area of the region, it still affects everybody because when that shut down, the price goes up. So we're all interconnected in this really unique way. To bring it back to early globalization, so the Silk Road, it's a lot more complicated now. And so what the world looks like now is there's a lot more trade. And as we discussed before, there's a lot less war, kinda. What do I mean, kinda? I'm just kidding. I know I can't hear you. And then we have this introduction of global superpowers, especially through nuclear weapons. And then developing states are more service oriented. They don't make stuff. Um, so think about your own parents or guardians growing up. What did he, she, or they do? Um, Very few of them, I imagine, relative to the world population, actually built stuff with their hands. I'm sure a lot of them did, but compared to the world population, that's not as common in the United States. For example, my dad worked for nonprofits most of his life, so it was moving money around a lot of the time. And my mom more or less did the same thing with the IRS. You compare that with their parents. My dad's dad was a butcher, and my mom's dad was a machinist at Oak Ridge National Lab. So both working with their hands as opposed to the economy now. And of course, neither of my grandmothers worked because it was, the 50s. But part of that's because of this increase in offshoring. So what is offshoring? Um, the USA has more strict regulations than the developing world, so the cost of import goes down. Cost to produce goods in the USA goes up, and it's cheaper to import. So why did I start this with shrimp? Well, like you probably know by now, I might have mentioned this 10 or 20,000 times throughout the semester. I'm from Charleston, South Carolina. Now, you'll know how like I try to be pretty precise when I say stuff, and don't like irony, don't like sarcasm. So you can believe me on face value when I say objectively, Charleston is the best city in the world. We've got that old French style architecture, that hint of a tropical theme. We got badasses like Robert Smalls, who escaped slave, stole a Confederate ship, gave it to the Union, and then became a politician after the war, um, and actually bought the house that he was a slave in, which is, I think it's pretty cool. We once got to be taken hostage by Blackbeard, and then we have this annual tradition where Darius Rucker from Hootie and the Blowfish gets a DUI. Yeah, so pretty cool. And yeah, I did my undergrad at the Citadel there. Very fun time, except for the beginning, middle, and end. But a big part of the city's identity is the shrimp. Um, there's Hyman Seafood, which is don't think it's still around actually, but was a super famous seafood place. And there's all the shrimp boats. There's the blessing of the shrimp fleet every year. At least if it's still going on because the shrimp fleet's dying off. And part of that is because Charleston has the best shrimp in the world. It's the best city in the world. What else would you expect? Now, I couldn't find a great citation for this, but um, I don't think I need one when I say Vietnam is far away from Charleston. If you can find where all these heart pins are, I'm doxing my favorite places. Of course, they're all in the South. But to go from Vietnam to Charleston by air takes about a day and 7 hours, which will be about my transit time to and from Mongolia too. Well, what does this have to do with globalization? Is this Charleston shrimp are of higher quality, only 5 miles from most houses in Charleston. Vietnam is precisely 9,149 miles from Charleston. So you're probably thinking, hold up, that has to mean that Charleston shrimp are way, 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 way cheaper and more popular than Vietnamese shrimp, right? Even in Charleston? Not the case. Labor is far cheaper in Vietnam. Operating costs are also cheaper, so insurance, boats, taxes, everything that goes into making a business run. And there are no shrimp trade tariffs between Vietnam and America. So I took the sacrifice and I spent money from my own bank account over spring break to do some field work, some self-funded field work um, as to the prices of shrimp in Charleston. I know, I know. I would do anything for you guys, like take a vacation in Charleston and buy some delicious shrimp. But shrimp from Charleston in Charleston costs $21.93 a pound. Shrimp from Vietnam in Charleston costs $14.99 per pound. That is the impact of globalization. You get more of what you want. The quality might go down. You might be hurting local businesses, but it's on them. It's imperative for them to be able to compete within this system. Is the logic. We can talk about how fair that is or not, or what the government can do. We'll talk about that in a second. But that's why I call it a study in shrimp. And this all plays in this idea of after hegemony. Cooperation and Discord in the World Economy by Robert Cohen. I've heard it pronounced both ways. But it's this idea that after hegemony, after these ages of conquest are over, so with the downfall of Hitler, which is, according to Schreier, like we talked about, the end of all these great world conquerors, um, we have to learn how to cooperate to resolve disputes. Now, Cohen argues this is through more institutions, especially for trade, because they're less likely to go to war. We talked about how America and China really don't get along, but they're not going to go to war, according to Cohen, as long as they're dependent on each other. So the cooperation is effectively killing competition because no matter how much they want to admit it, they both kind of need each other. I think the example I used last lecture was Tom Brady and Peyton Manning. There's this idea of a rising tide lifts all boats, that rivalry theory. There's more dependence on each other. And through these institutions, when disputes do arise, there's more places to resolve them. And there's an international audience that can weigh in on it and say, like, hey, United States, hey, China, you're kind of being you're not the aggrieved party in this. You need to listen to what the other side is saying. Okay, so I was finally able to find a TikTok video where I learned that Peyton Manning and Tom Brady are actually like rivals that made each other better. So I don't have to keep talking about Goku and Vegeta. I feel like this is more accessible. So here's what it was like when Robert Cohen wrote After Hegemony.
What up? Yeah, I just want to give a quick appreciation to China's threat of total domination. Now, I know you guys are going to be like, whoa, Cha. Should appreciate to China? What are you in cahoots with Xi Jinping? You turning against red, white, and blue? Hell no. I'm a patriot. I'm just stoked on the benefits of a dank rivalry. China keeps us on our toes. You know, we could just sit back in the seat of global power and say what up to our massive geographical advantage, but what up? Yeah, I just want to give a quick appreciation to China's threat of total domination. Now, I know you guys are going to be like, whoa, Cha. Should appreciate to China? What are you in cahoots with Xi Jinping? You turning against red, white, and blue? Hell no. I'm a patriot.
All right, with that, we have 9 slides after this, it looks like. 10 slides after this. And then y'all are good to go. But it's a good drop-off point for a break if y'all want to take one. So with industrial policy, is mainly how the United States will manipulate how it cooperates. Since that's not tariffing what is not essential and can be made in the United States. We've already been over that quite a bit. Another one is the silver rule. Coining that myself. I don't know if there actually is a silver rule. I guess I could look it up on Wikipedia, but I'm already on my computer doing this. But it is mainly around taxing and subsidizing. But it's this very simple idea on how the government regulates what it likes and doesn't like without outright banning stuff. Because we have a Bill of Rights, because of all this other stuff, this great respect for individual liberty, the United States tends to avoid banning stuff unless it's immediately harmful. But what it can do is tax and subsidize. So the taxing side is actually quite easy. If there is something that the government doesn't like going on in society, but can't outright ban for whatever reason, it puts a tax on it a lot of the time. It's less and less common now. Whereas some of the only modern examples we'll see, even on like day-to-day life, are so something that's bad for society that you pay an extra tax for. What would that be? If you said alcohol or cigarettes, then yeah, you're probably familiar with what the sin tax is. Not syntax, S-Y-N-T-A-X, like in a computer, but S-I-N space T-A-X, as in like biblical sin. But alcohol and cigarettes are not only bad for you, they're bad for society. If you get sick from consuming them, you're probably going to be riding in the health insurance wagon more than you're actually pushing it, especially the older you get. Just the idea is that the government will raise taxes on that, and then it helps. Another big one is like liquor stores reduce property values. So if someone opens up a liquor store next to your house is probably going to lose some amount of value. Of course, when I was 22, no, hold on, 23, I had the rare chance to live within walking distance of a jazz bar, and that did not hurt my property value, or at least how I valued that property, even though I rented it, but still. So alcohol, cigarettes, generally historically taxed because they're bad for society, especially cigarettes. I think we're talking about 2008 again, but the UK just banned cigarettes outright for anyone born 2008 or later, which I'm all for. Cigarettes are gross. No smoke. Oh, hey, no pun intended. No heat or whatever. No smoke on people who smoke. Historically, there was also something called the luxury tax, um, but it's this idea that okay, luxury goods are actually bad for society because what they do is they put all sorts of resources into products that only the 1% are going to use, or we'll say even like the 5 or 10% are going to use, which is exploitative and wasteful and could be better used servicing the average American in this case. So what there used to be was something called a luxury tax, where if you were going to buy something that's considered a luxury, you have to pay even more, and some of that money goes to the government. Um, there is a push within the environmentalist movement to actually put up a carbon tax. So what this would do is if you are a company that produces a lot of carbon, so pollutes a lot, what would happen is you either pay a lot for the privilege of making that carbon, and that money would, I assume, go to fighting climate change, or you would develop green energy, green power. Um, I believe Al Gore, so Clinton's vice president, was sort of like the guy who kicked off the environmentalist or climate change debate. Was a big supporter of the carbon tax. And then we talked about tariffs at length already. Um, but that's effectively what we're talking about with the silver rule. If you don't like stuff coming in cheap from other countries, you tax it, you make it more expensive. So people can still have access to the, if they really want, but they do need to pay more. Now, the opposite of a tax is a subsidy. There's a joke in The Simpsons where Bart becomes a farmer and starts cashing subsidy checks for not growing crops. And when I was a kid, I saw that and I thought, well, that's bull crap. Like, that's a load of bull. Well, hey there, mister. That's not cool. I don't grow crops all the time. I'm actively not growing food right now. Why don't I get a check from the government, but farmers do? Well, it comes from this whole dust bowl mentality where it's like the farmers are going to give subsidy checks to farms because they don't want the farms to go out of business if there's a bad year. So they have like a guaranteed income from the government to stay afloat for the next year. And so that's taxpayer money going to keep these farms afloat because we get a benefit from it, because we all benefit from farms being stable and not having to worry about going out of business, because if the farms go out of business, then um, we don't get to eat. Now, subsidies are different than like public services and stuff like that. Like we wouldn't say the police department is subsidized. We would just say it's a government service. The difference is the government doesn't own, at least doesn't 100% own something it's helping fund. That's a subsidy. So the government doesn't own the farms that it gives subsidy checks to, but it still gives them money to keep them afloat. The government likes having farms in the United States, so it's willing to pay money to help these farms stay profitable, to stay in business. Um, I keep moving the goalpost. To stay in business because we all benefit. You don't have to live anywhere near a farm to benefit from farms producing a lot of food. Who doesn't like cheaper food? So with like public schools, that's a government that's a government service. But with private schools or training schools or stuff like that, they're still subsidized by the government. Same goes for weapons manufacturers. Even if we're not actively at war, the government is still encouraged to not only buy weapons it doesn't need, but still give big tax write-offs to the defense industry because, like with farms, the government wants to keep the defense industry in the United States. I think I talked about this before, but around 2004, 2005, I don't know how I remember that. I was so young, but there was a big debate. I think it's because like our teacher asked us, and I was like, I'm in the fifth grade. I don't know. Our teacher asked us like, should we be making weapons in America, or should we be making weapons for the army in America or in another country? And I was like, I'm, in fifth grade. I'm still trying to figure out how to spell the word cat. That's a joke. I don't know about weapons industry and policy. Nice of the teacher to think that highly of us, I guess. Public transportation, sometimes it is government owned, but you still have to pay, so it's considered subsidized. It's not for free, that's the point. The technology industry, like with the CHIPS Act, it makes sense for the government to pay to keep these local. And then housing overall. And then on a more local level and like soft power version of this, we see a great example being Disney. So not actually Itchy and Scratchy Land, but the real world Disney parks. The government likes to subsidize stuff too because it gives it direct control over it. So regardless of how you feel about, I think I've talked about this before too. I can't stand the word woke. Um, for all sorts of reasons, but one being that nobody can define it. So when I say it's not a good word or it's a bad word, I don't mean it's like a curse word or a swear word. I mean, it doesn't do the basic function of what a word should do. It doesn't convey meaning other than what the listener decides it means. So DeSantis was accusing Disney of being too culturally progressive, we'll say. And he tried to exert the subsidies the state of Florida gives to Disney. For those who don't know, Disney gets a bunch of tax breaks to stay in Florida because it helps the Floridian economy. But DeSantis had decided culturally Disney had gone too far left and decided to start using withdrawal of those subsidies as a way, or the threat of the withdrawal as a way to force Disney into being less culturally progressive, or quote unquote woke. It ended up just sort of being an embarrassing mess that made both sides look bad. But yeah, point being is that when the government subsidizes something, it can create dependence. So the farmers depend on the government. Disney doesn't really depend on DeSantis, but it really likes the tax breaks and everything, so it's willing to play ball with him a bit. So how does the government tax and subsidize stuff? The short answer is that if it wants to, it's going to find a way. And if the supporters want it, but it doesn't want to, then it's going to find an excuse. So the executive controls most policy through the cabinet, so all the different secretaries we talked about. And it has the most control over the military, with the exception of the War Powers Resolution. But say the cabinet and the military are both off the table for whatever reason, the president can still use what's called the bully pulpit, or the status that comes with being the president to shame congressmen or local representatives into something. And then there's legislative control. Congress has the power of the purse, so it has most control over spending and its ability to ratify treaties, which is another form of cooperation, right? So this gives it direct control over subsidies and taxes and can tell the president what to do. Executive means the president executes the will of Congress, but he doesn't get to determine what the will of Congress is, outside of stuff like veto power. So Congress, generally, I would say, is more powerful than the president on this, but it's less willing to move because it's hundreds of people where the president just has to move unilaterally. Congress is built more on compromise. A great example of both of them working together to subsidize something where he talks about the CHIPS Act. So Biden promoted it with the bully pulpit, pushed it through Congress. Of course, politics is the art of the compromise. Congress had to go through all these different rounds and drafts and compromises for what the CHIPS Act would look like. But what it ultimately did was subsidize the cost of computers in the United States, not immediately, but a lot of the facilities should come online in the next 5 to 10 years. Not the result probably most of you were looking for, but it goes to that whole saying, the best time to build a computer factory or a chips factory was 5 to 10 years ago. The second best time is now. It's actually about like apple trees or something, but the logic still holds. And soft power really doesn't register enough in terms of cooperation. Like it helps after all the foundations are laid. So I'd say the closest thing we have to soft power without it fully being soft power would be ambassadors. And this is still like US policy instead of Hollywood or EA or something like that. And there's the two types of ambassadors we already talked about. So there's state to state. So here is Herschel Walker, our ambassador to the Bahamas. And then the UN ambassador, so Waltz. Or you could think of the UN ambassador as state to states, plural. But this, of course, affects cooperation because of how the US is seen, how relations are maintained, and everything. So, still very important. And that is competition and cooperation in US foreign policy. So, we went over competition, the importance of the different factors of production, how they are taken through competition, through coercion, and then cooperation. So, that's globalism, globalization. We talked about the first and second waves. So, first wave being especially between the Renaissance and the really given a boost by the steam engine, and the second wave being the post-war years, and after hegemony. So what we live in now with the United States at the seat of global power, but with its quote-unquote dank rival, China. Then finally, the silver rule, what the government does to regulate this, or how it regulates, especially cooperation, and different ways to control it. So executive, legislative, and ambassadors. So the fun thing about email is you can reach me anywhere, including Mongolia. Like I said before, by the time you will see this, I will be in Mongolia. So yeah, I can definitely take a break from horseback riding, archery, and falcon hunting to respond to your emails because I'm always in your corner. And I actually mean that. I do want the best for y'all, even though most of us haven't met face to face. So please do reach out if you have any questions or comments. All right, guys. See ya.